The air in Civitas was thick with emotion that morning. The city buzzed, like any other day in the fast-paced metropolis, with the sounds of honking cars, distant conversations, and the hum of 1,000 disconnected lives moving in their own rhythms. But for Ethan Bellamy, a 32-year-old insurance adjuster who preferred routine over unpredictability, it was a different kind of day. A strange, unsettling day. As Ethan stepped outside his apartment building on 9th and Oak, he immediately felt it, a burst of joy, but not his own. His chest lightened with a strange exhilaration that, for a moment, made him think that maybe this was the day he'd finally won the lottery, or perhaps had received an unexpected windfall. He paused and looked around, trying to locate the source of this sudden happiness. It came from an elderly woman, carefully making her way down the street. She wore a bright yellow hat and a flower-patterned dress that clashed in the best way with the dull gray of the city. Her shoes clicked with a rhythmic certainty on the pavement, and she was smiling, a smile that seemed a little too wide, a little too infectious, as if life were more beautiful for her in that moment than anyone else. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the feeling. He didn't have time for strange emotional intrusions. He had deadlines to meet, reports to file, and a list of responsibilities that never seemed to shrink no matter how hard he worked. But before he could turn away, the joy began to fade and was replaced by something darker, more insistent. Anger, sharp and bitter, coursed through him like a lightning bolt, striking him so suddenly it made his heart race. The source? A man in a suit, arms crossed tight, his face twisted with frustration as he stood at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Ethan could feel his seething resentment. Frustration with the city. Frustration with his life. Frustration with the unfulfilled promises of adulthood. And there was something else, a deep, long-simmering dissatisfaction that seemed to permeate his every action, his every word. Ethan was awash with the kind of rage that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, it was too much. He staggered slightly on the sidewalk, gripping the nearest lamppost to steady himself, feeling the world around him crash with emotions that weren't even his own. He was drowning in other people's feelings. Jesus, Ethan muttered to himself, trying to ground himself in something solid. He took a deep breath, but before he could collect himself, another emotional wave hit him, sorrow, raw and aching, seeping through him as if he were physically absorbing someone's pain. The homeless man sitting against the wall nearby had his eyes closed, but Ethan could feel the weight of a lifetime of loss and rejection pressing down on him. That was the moment Ethan realized something had changed. The next few hours were a blur. Every interaction, no matter how small, carried an emotional undercurrent that Ethan could no longer ignore. He could hear the hunger in the voice of the barista at his usual cafe as she handed him his coffee, a sharp contrast to the friendly smile she wore. He could feel the fear that gripped the commuters on the subway, the palpable anxiety of people trying to get through their daily grind without being swallowed by the weight of their lives. At work, things only worsened. Ethan was no longer just an observer of emotions, he was a conduit for them. When he spoke with his colleague Rachel, he could feel every nuance of her grief, her quiet frustration at a relationship that had fallen apart. When he discussed a claim with a client, their insecurities and desperation seemed to crawl under his skin like insects. By the time lunch came around, Ethan was nearly on the edge. The mental fatigue of carrying the emotional weight of strangers was unbearable. He needed to understand what was happening, but more importantly, he needed to get control. There was something deeply unsettling about feeling so much all at once. His mind and body were constantly being pulled in different emotional directions, and it was starting to affect his physical health. That night, as he tried to sleep, he felt the anxiety of the world pressing down on him. His bed, once a safe haven, now felt like a prison of emotional overload. He closed his eyes, but instead of silence, there was a constant roar of emotions. The only relief came in brief, dreamless moments of nothingness, but they were short-lived, and the flood would return with even greater force. The following day, Ethan made his way to his office, dreading the inevitable emotional maelstrom that would greet him. But this time, he tried something new. He tried to block it out, to push the emotions away, to focus on his work and nothing else. He ignored the anxiety in the voices of his co-workers, the ache in the back of his throat from the endless sorrow he had carried since morning. Then, something strange happened. As he was walking to the break room, he passed by Rachel, who was sitting quietly at her desk. She looked up at him, her eyes bloodshot and tired, but her smile was still faintly present, a mask of normalcy. Before he could say anything, he felt it, the pull of her grief, but also something else. For the first time, Ethan didn't just feel her sorrow. He understood it. He felt like he could see inside her, as if the walls of their usual office conversations had crumbled, revealing the raw truth behind them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost unsure of himself. Rachel blinked, surprised by the question. Yeah, I'm fine. Just been a rough week." Ethan could feel the hidden layers beneath her words, the sleepless nights, the nights spent texting a boyfriend who didn't love her back, the hours spent trying to smile through the sadness. He could feel it all, and it left him breathless. "Rachel," he said, his voice suddenly softer, "you don't have to hide it. I can tell you're struggling." Rachel's face shifted from surprise to something more vulnerable, more open. She looked at him, eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "I'm just tired of pretending," she confessed, barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Ethan felt the truth of her words resonate deep within him. It was like the weight of all the unspoken pain in the world had coalesced in that one moment, and he was somehow tethered to it, a bridge between her soul and his. He didn't know how or why, but he was beginning to understand people in ways that were terrifying. His ability was no longer just an intrusion, it was a connection. And that connection, that raw empathy, was beginning to take hold of him in ways he couldn't comprehend. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. Ethan Bellamy had started something that would change not only his life, but the life of the entire city. The day passed, and Ethan's mental exhaustion only deepened. The city outside seemed to pulse with the overwhelming emotional weight of its inhabitants. But in the midst of this, there was a curious, subtle shift. The violence on the streets of Civitas had noticeably diminished. People were more polite. Tempers were calmer. Conversations, though tense at times, were laced with a strange, fragile understanding. Ethan knew something was happening, something out of his control. But he was too tired to investigate. Instead, he decided to head home early. He needed rest, needed space to think, to understand the forces at work inside him, but when he arrived at his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had already begun. Civitas, once a city of buzzing energy and occasional aggression, was slowly changing. The rage was dimming, but at what cost? And where would it all lead? For the first time, Ethan was not just a bystander in the story of the city, he was its central character, and the city was beginning to change around him. But whether for better or for worse, that was a question he was yet to answer. Ethan sat in his apartment that night, staring blankly at the walls. The city outside was quieter than usual, a muted hum of life that seemed softer, more peaceful. His apartment, once a sanctuary from the chaos of the world, now felt hollow. Every corner seemed to echo with a strange unease. The weight of the emotions he had absorbed throughout the day hung over him like a storm cloud, a persistent pressure that made his head ache and his thoughts scattered. He closed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling that something had changed in a way he couldn't quite understand. The city was different now. It wasn't just the physical changes, the quieter streets, the fewer shouting matches, the softer sounds of conversations, but something deeper, something in the air itself. Civitas had been a city of unspoken tension, of the subtle anger that simmered under the surface of everyday life. Now, that anger was gone, replaced by a pervasive sadness, a shared grief that seemed to float in the spaces between people. The violence had dissipated, but it had been replaced by something more insidious, something harder to bear. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. He glanced down and saw Rachel's name flashing on the screen. He hesitated before picking up. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, almost too soft. "I don't know what's happening, but I feel strange. I feel everything." Everyone's pain, their sadness. I can't stop feeling it. I can't even remember what my own feelings are anymore. Ethan's heart sank. He'd known it would come to this. He had felt the shift in Rachel ever since their conversation earlier that day. The walls she had carefully built around her own pain were crumbling, and now she was overwhelmed by the raw emotions of everyone around her. The weight of those emotions wasn't just something he was feeling, it was affecting everyone. The empathy was spreading, and it was suffocating them. "Rachel," he said softly, "I know. I feel it too. It's like the entire city is one big, open wound. It's too much." There was a long pause on the other end. He could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, as if she were trying to steady herself, but it wasn't working. "I can't stand it, Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep carrying all this. It's too much. I don't even know what's mine anymore. What's real? What's—" She broke off, the words choked with emotion. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned back into his couch, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had to do something. He couldn't just let the entire city collapse under the weight of their collective emotional burden. But what could he do? How could he fix something so profound, something so fundamentally human? "Listen to me," he said, trying to calm his own racing heart. "I know it feels impossible, but we have to hold on. We have to try to make sense of this, even if it's just for a little while. We need to figure out why this is happening, why we're feeling this way." Rachel sniffed on the other end of the line. "I'm scared, Ethan. I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't know how to stop it." "I don't either," he admitted, his voice low. "But I'm not going to let this ruin us, okay? We'll figure it out. Together." When he hung up, he sat there for a long time, the silence pressing in around him. The apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with an invisible weight. He had never realized how quiet the city could be, how oppressive the silence could become when it was filled with so many unspoken emotions that he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the skyline. Civitas stretched out before him, a sprawling mass of lights and concrete, each person a tiny speck of emotion, of life, in the sea of the city. The streets below, once chaotic and frenetic, were now eerily calm. People walked by with blank expressions, their faces haunted by the invisible load they carried, but there was no shouting, no fighting, no open confrontation. The tension had dissolved, yes, but it had been replaced by a quiet suffering, a shared sense of loss that was impossible to ignore. Ethan turned away from the window and paced back and forth in his small apartment. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. He had no answers, no solutions. What had started as an unexpected gift, the ability to understand the emotions of others, was rapidly becoming a curse. People were being overwhelmed by the constant flood of feelings, unable to distinguish their own from those around them. It was breaking them down, piece by piece, but there was something else. Ethan couldn't ignore the fact that, despite the emotional turmoil, the city had changed. People weren't hurting each other the way they used to. The violence, the anger, the petty crimes, all of it had disappeared. At first, it had seemed like a miracle. But now, he wondered if it had come at too great a cost. The next morning, Ethan went to work, though he didn't really feel like working. His head was still spinning from the emotional overload of the previous day. But when he walked into the office, he noticed something different. His co-workers, usually distracted by their own personal dramas, were quieter, more subdued. They sat at their desks in almost complete silence, each one lost in their own thoughts. Rachel wasn't there when he arrived. She had called in sick, claiming she wasn't feeling well, though Ethan suspected it was more than just physical illness. He'd left her a message, but she hadn't returned his call. He could only hope she was taking some time for herself, that she wasn't drowning in the emotions that were threatening to consume her. As the day wore on, Ethan tried to focus on work. He had to. He had to keep going, to keep some semblance of normalcy in his life, but the pull of the emotions around him was overwhelming. He could feel the weight of his colleagues' lives pressing on him, the strain of their unspoken struggles, their fears, their doubts. It was like living in a constant state of static, a never-ending buzz of emotional noise. At lunchtime, he took a walk outside, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. But as soon as he stepped onto the street, he felt it, the flood of emotions, of empathy, hitting him all at once. It wasn't just the usual rush of feelings, it was amplified, like the entire city was somehow more attuned to each other's pain. He stopped walking and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the emotions wash over him. Fear. Desperation. Loneliness. Each one hit him like a slap, one after another. It was unbearable, and it felt like his heart was going to explode. But beneath all of it, there was something else, something unfamiliar, something unexpected. It was hope. A fleeting, fragile hope, like a distant light in the fog. It came from a woman standing a few feet away, looking up at the sky as if she had just glimpsed something beautiful. Ethan reached out for that feeling, grabbed onto it like a lifeline. He tried to hold on to the hope, to let it fill him up, to drown out the pain that had been drowning everyone else. For a moment, he felt a sense of calm, of clarity, but it didn't last. The emotions, all of them, came rushing back, and Ethan realized something terrifying. He couldn't escape it. The city was changing, but not in the way he had hoped. People weren't just becoming more connected. They were becoming overwhelmed. They were drowning in their own empathy, and it was dragging them down with it. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep again. The emotional weight of the world pressed on him, but this time it wasn't just his own feelings he was dealing with. He was starting to feel the emotional exhaustion of an entire city, no, an entire world, on his shoulders. He thought about Rachel, about how she was suffering. He thought about the woman on the street, the flicker of hope he had felt from her. Was it real? Was there a way to use this ability, to harness it, to help people without causing them to crumble under its weight? The answer wasn't clear, but Ethan knew one thing: he couldn't keep going like this. He had to find a way to stop it, or the city, the world, would fall apart, and he had no idea how to do that. Ethan's thoughts kept spiraling into darker corners as he stared at the ceiling in his apartment, the shadows of the city creeping through the blinds. The weight of the world was on his chest, suffocating him with each breath he took. He had hoped for something different when he first discovered his ability to connect with others on such a deep, emotional level. He had believed that understanding people, truly understanding them, would make the world a better place. He had believed that empathy was the key to peace, to healing. But now, the truth was beginning to dawn on him: empathy wasn't a cure, it was a burden. It wasn't something people were ready for, and it wasn't something the world could handle. For days, the emotional overload had continued, each interaction with another person leaving him more drained, more broken. It wasn't just the pain that people were carrying, it was the collective weight of every single person's sorrow, fear, and confusion. His mind was a tangled mess of other people's emotions, and he had no way to escape. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The city, too, had changed. The streets were quieter, but not in a peaceful way. People had become withdrawn, closed off, unable to function in the way they once did. They were too caught up in the emotional storm to go about their day-to-day lives. The connection that had once seemed so promising now felt like a curse, but still, Ethan couldn't ignore the way it had altered the dynamics of the city. The violence had gone away. People no longer screamed at each other on street corners or cut each other off in traffic. There was a strange, pervasive calm in the air, almost unnatural, like the calm before a storm. But that was the thing about storms. They were never as quiet as they seemed before they hit. They were filled with pent-up energy, just waiting to explode. Ethan knew that if he didn't figure out how to stop this, how to contain the emotional flood, the city wouldn't just suffer, it would break. People couldn't go on like this, absorbing and processing the weight of each other's lives with no respite. Eventually, something would give. People would snap. He would snap. He sat up suddenly, the need to do something more urgent now. He grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, stepping out into the cold night air. the streets of Civitas empty and silent. His feet carried him without thinking, as if his body was already leading the way. He didn't know what he was looking for, he just knew he couldn't keep carrying the world's emotions alone. Ethan walked through the city, past empty storefronts and quiet intersections. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, of feelings that weren't even his own. He could feel everything, the desperation of someone on the brink of losing everything, the loneliness of a child lost in the crowd, the rage of a young man who had been ignored his entire life. He could taste the bitterness in the air, the collective sorrow that had become a permanent fixture in the streets. But amidst all the pain, there was something else, something flickering in the distance, something he hadn't noticed before. A woman. Ethan slowed as he approached her, feeling the pull of her emotions. She wasn't like the others, not like the people whose pain had overwhelmed him so often in the past. She wasn't drowning in grief or rage, she was standing there, still, with a sense of purpose that seemed to push back against the tide of emotions around her. He could feel a quiet strength radiating from her, something steady, something that didn't crack under the weight of the world. She stood at the edge of the street, looking up at the sky, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. She seemed untouched by the turmoil that surrounded her, a contrast to the rest of the city. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a flicker of something other than overwhelm. He felt the calm that emanated from her. It was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had been suffocating. "Are you okay?" he found himself asking, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was something in them, a knowing, a depth that reached far beyond the surface. She didn't look surprised to see him, didn't look startled by the sudden intrusion into her space. It was as though she had been expecting him all along. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "But you're not." Ethan frowned, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "You're carrying too much," she said simply. "You're not the only one, you know. People like you, who can feel everyone else's pain. You're not the only one struggling." Her words hung in the air between them, heavier than any of the emotions Ethan had been carrying. He had heard people talk about empathy before, in theory, but no one had ever spoken to him like this. As if she understood exactly what he was going through. "Who are you?" he asked, almost afraid to know. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was knowing, as though she had seen this all before. "Someone who's learned to live with it," she said softly. "Someone who's learned how to bear the weight." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. How? How do you do it? How do you stop it from destroying you?" She took a step closer to him, her presence grounding him in a way that was both foreign and familiar. "You don't stop it, Ethan. You learn how to balance it. You learn how to let it flow through you without letting it consume you. It's not about escaping the pain, it's about understanding it. Accepting it." Her words resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. For a brief moment, the whirlwind of emotions around him slowed, and he felt clarity. The way she spoke, calm, centered, like someone who had found peace in the chaos, was the first thing he had felt in days that didn't feel like an emotional bomb waiting to explode. "You think you're the only one who feels all this?" she continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're not. Everyone is carrying something. Everyone is suffering, but that doesn't mean we're supposed to let it destroy us. You've been given this ability, yes, but it's not a curse. It's a choice. You can choose how to carry it." Ethan swallowed, feeling something inside him shift. Could it really be that simple? Could he really choose how to deal with all of this, all the overwhelming emotion that was dragging him under? "What do I do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The woman's smile softened. "You start by embracing the empathy. You accept it as part of you, and you allow it to teach you. You can't stop feeling, Ethan. That's the mistake people make. They think they can shut it off, compartmentalize it. But that just makes it worse. You need to feel it all, to live with it, without letting it destroy you. You need to find your center, and then you can help others find theirs." Ethan stared at her, a new sense of hope creeping in, the first real hope he'd felt in days. It wasn't an easy solution, wasn't something that would just fix everything with a snap of his fingers. But it was something. It was a way forward, a way to live with the overwhelming emotions, not in spite of them. He nodded, the weight on his chest suddenly lighter. He still didn't know what would happen next, or how long this journey would take, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a path ahead of him. A path where empathy wasn't a burden, it was a gift. The woman turned to leave, her figure slowly fading into the night, but her words lingered in the air. Remember, Ethan. It's not about controlling the world's pain. It's about learning to walk alongside it. Ethan watched her disappear into the shadows, the quiet night swallowing her figure, but he felt something different now. Calm. A fragile peace, and for the first time in days, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to live with the weight of the world.